Hi guys, let's take a few minutes and talk about the controller role for a bit. Sadly, I see a lot of players who don't really play controllers. Essentially, they play DPSs that are in controller stance, which usually means that they end up playing pretty weak DPSs. And sadly, we see that all the way to combat rating at 100, 150, even 170. We have players who reach essentially endgame content who don't know how to play as a controller. And we can't really blame them. Essentially, the game teaches you to play as a DPS. From level 1 to level 10, you play only as a DPS. And even once you reach level 10 and you can play as a controller, the game doesn't really teach you how to play as a controller. So people have to learn on their own, and a lot of people just don't. They just keep on playing as a DPS, even if they switch to the controller role. Which is in part why I started making those videos. Essentially, there's no real good tutorial in the game, so I started making videos to try to help out players. The first priority of the controller is to give power to the group. I know a lot of players who probably aren't happy that I'm saying that, but sadly that's the hard truth. The reason why people don't like that is that they don't want to be considered batteries. Sadly, that is the role of the controller. The controller is the one who has to make sure that the whole group is well supplied in power so that they can use their powers to do their role. For the tank to be able to do his role, he needs to have power. He needs to be able to cast his powers. And the same for the healer. If the healer wants to keep the tank alive, or the group alive for that matter, he also needs to have power. Even the DPSs need power. Sadly, they pretty much come last in the list of priority in terms of giving power to the group. First, you have to make sure that the tank and the healer are well supplied in power. The reason for that is quite simple. The tank is keeping the enemies focused on him. If the tank dies, the enemies will jump on the healer, and if the healer dies, the group dies. If the healer cannot heal the group will die. And the same is true for the healer. If the healer doesn't have power, the healer won't be able to heal the tank and keep him alive. So again, the tank will die, the healer will die, and the group will die. So it's essentially it's a chain. The controller has to supply the healer and the tank with power so that the tank can keep the enemies focused on him to keep the group alive, and the healer can heal the tank and heal the group to keep everyone alive. The reason why I say that the DPS comes last in the list of priorities when it comes to giving out power is that if the tank doesn't have power, the group dies. If the healer doesn't have power, the group dies. If the DPS doesn't have power, all that really happens is that the DPS won't be doing as much damage as he should. He can still do damage. He can, at the very worst, he can use his weapons to do damage. Of course, he will not do that as much damage as if he's using his advanced mechanics with his powers, but he will still be able to do damage. As opposed to the tank, if the tank has no power, the tank cannot do his job. If the healer doesn't have power, the healer cannot do his job. So these two should come first, and then the DPSs should come next. To give power, most controllers have various tools. They have the power over time, they have the power dumps, and some DPSs also have group shields which also give power. But there's also other things like the gadget controller has a battle drone that can give out power. So essentially each controller has various ways to give power to the group. I won't go into them because I've already made videos about those. Essentially I've made videos about the power over time of all the controllers, and I've made a few videos about the controllers and their various powers. So I'd suggest you go watch those videos if you need more information about how the controller can give power to the group. The second priority of the controller would be to cast what is known as debuffs. In this universe online, there's something known as buffs, and there's the opposite, which is known as debuffs. Buffs essentially are bonuses that you can give to your group and your friends so that they can do more damage or be more powerful, essentially. And debuffs are malices that you can cast on enemy players or enemy NPCs that will weaken them. And there's essentially three types of debuffs. There's defense debuffs, there's attack debuffs, and there's healing debuffs. Essentially, the defense debuffs will lower the defense of enemies so that they can be damaged more easily. The attack debuffs will lower the attack of enemies so that the enemies will do less damage. And the healing debuffs will reduce the ability to heal from certain enemies. Essentially, there are enemies in this universe online who can heal themselves. So if we cast a healing debuff on them, we will reduce their healing abilities. If you need more information about debuffs, I've already explained how debuffs work in previous videos about controllers. And then the third priority for the controller is the crowd control. I know it may seem ironic, seeing how the role is called controller, but there is room for things to mean more than they literally mean. What I'm saying by that is that essentially don't take the name controller too literally. Even though the role is called controller, in reality the controller shares controlling duties with the tank. Heck, you would say even that the tank is the one who actually does the lion's share of the controlling. To keep it simple, essentially the crowd control of the controller could make the job harder for the tank. So ideally you want to leave most of the crowd controlling to the tank, and if you see enemies that escape the control of the tank, then the controller should step in and control those enemies. Usually what will happen is that the tank will control most of the enemies, but then a few enemies will escape from the control of the tank and will try to jump the healer. So before they jump the healer, then the controller should step in and control those enemies before they kill the poor healer. Again, I know that it may seem ironic that the controller is not the one who actually does the crowd control, but that's pretty much how it works. Ideally, the tank and the controller should communicate with each other to decide who does the lion's share of the crowd control and who controls which enemies, but sadly in this universe online, a lot of players don't use a microphone, so it's not always an option. So by default, I would say leave the crowd control to the tank, and whatever enemies that the tank doesn't manage to control, then step in and control those. And the last thing that the controller should try to do is to keep the group alive using his group shield. Although not every controller has a group shield, the gadget controller doesn't have one, but most controller power have a group shield that can help them try to keep the group alive. So technically, controllers are jack of all trades. Essentially, they can give power, they can cast debuff, they can cast crowd control, and in some cases, they can even keep the group alive using group shields. They can even do a bit of damage, but doing damage should never be the main focus of the controller. Sadly, I see way too many controllers who use up all their powers to try to do some damage, and when comes the time to give power to the group or to cast some debuffs, oopsie, they're out of power and they cannot do so. So as a controller, you should never really worry about doing damage. You should never worry about being at the top of the scoreboard doing the top damage. That should never be your focus. So give power, cast debuff, cast crowd control, cast group shield, and then if you can do some damage. But again, that should never be your focus. You should never focus so much on doing damage that you forget to do your role. So I hope this made some sort of sense. So I tried to keep this simple, but there's surely quite a few things I didn't mention, either because I've already made videos about them, like for example I've already made a video about the double tick, so I didn't explain that in this video, but also I'm trying to keep that simple so that people can get at least a basic idea of what the controller role is supposed to do. So obviously I didn't cover everything, so either I've covered more information in previous videos, or I'm planning to make future videos where I'll cover some of the information that I didn't quite cover in this video. So that's pretty much it for now, guys. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.